Well, tanks returned to the Syrian city of Homs last night as a group of UN human rights inspectors has travelled to Syria this weekend to see firsthand how the regime is dealing with demonstrators. The death toll so far is said to be over 2,000 since the crackdown by the regime began in March on protests. The Baathist regime insists that it is open to reform but is coming under attack from outside forces supporting militants in Syria. Protesters reject such claims, saying they're designed to discredit calls for change. For the following report, I've been speaking to members of the opposition and analysts. Tanks rolling on the streets of Latakia during the week. Another Syrian city, another brutal response to those opposing the Assad regime. By contrast to the swift moves to intervene in Libya, it wasn't until this week that the United States President Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton called for Bashar al-Assad to go and announced sanctions that would hit oil exports.
In peaceful demonstrations across the nation, Syrians are demanding their universal human rights. The regime has answered their demands with empty promises and horrific violence. This morning, President Obama called on Assad to step aside. The transition to democracy in Syria has begun, and it's time for Assad to get out of the way.
But with voices raised in the streets since March, what took them so long? Perhaps it was concern for what might follow the devil they knew, and a fear that life after Assad might bring about the appalling vista of sectarian conflict, which would spill over into Lebanon and present another security headache for Israel to deal with along its border. The Syrian regime has always insisted that it isn't cracking down on protests, but rather on criminals and Islamist insurgents. Bashar al-Jafari, the Baathist regime's UN ambassador, articulated this on CNN last week.
What's going on in Syria is that we do have an opposition, legitimate national opposition, and we are listening to their claims. But at the same time, we do have armed terrorist groups that are resisting the Syrian forces, those who have killed so far 500 officers and soldiers of our army and police officers. They are the outcomes of the American-British invasion of Iraq. They are the Salafists, they are the Takfiris groups, they are the Brother Muslim military wing. They are all these kind of extremist groups in the area.
This argument has also been echoed by Alistair Crook, a former MI6 operative and previously an advisor to the EU's former foreign policy chief Javier Solana.
The Syrian security forces have actually been facing quite heavily armed. I mean by that with heavy machine guns, with rocket-propelled grenade groups who are fighting the security forces in a form of very low-level insurgency. Now, these groups are not peaceful pro-democracy protesters. Many of these people, as I wrote, are those that during the war in Iraq went from Syria, left Syria, crossed quietly the border into Iraq to fight the occupation, to fight the American forces there.
Those opposing the regime reject this analysis. Sheikh Muhammad al-Yaqoubi has recently left Syria, having been banned from speaking out against the regime at the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. He asks, if there are armed Salafists in Syria, why are they only appearing now?
It's very funny to hear this, Colm. It's really funny. Syria has been known as a peaceful country for many years. Now the country, the Secret Service, the army, the police, there was no one incident of that type which would have, pointed out to thousands of insurgents around the country. All of a sudden, how can we believe that the president himself in his first speech said there were 65,000 gangsters fighting around the country? He said we're fighting an army. Now, how come that 65,000 people, it couldn't be believed? And these people are in Damascus, in every village around Damascus, in Dar'a, in every village in Hawran in the south, in Deir ez-Zor in the east, in Bukamal, in Latakia, at the Mediterranean shores, in Banyas, in Jabla, in Aleppo, in Homs, in Luxor, everywhere. It's the Syrian people. It's the Syrian people actually who are resisting the regime.
Also sceptical of Crook's view is Petra Steenan, an author and Middle East expert who served as a diplomat for the Dutch government in Damascus.
Now, I run this this thought and this information by a few people I know in Syria, and they all say it's nonsense. And they say it's nonsense because in their view and in their assessment and what they've learned from the different protests in the different cities and villages, people are actually calling for unity all the time. Now, I think what I also heard is, of course, like after the attack in Jisr Shurur a month ago, of course people want to defend their villages and their people. So there might well be armed clashes and attacks by normal citizens. I mean, there are a lot of arms in Syria, but whether it's really a Salafist concerted movement, I doubt it.
But Alistair Crook takes his argument a step further. Not only does he believe that the majority of Syrians want Assad to stay in power, he believes that those Syrians in exile who profess to be secular democratic reformers are using the Salafists to foment revolutionary conditions.
The exiles are not Islamists, they're not Salafis, but mostly they are trying to use this small vanguard of armed people to try and force a confrontation, force an explosion in Syria, which would then polarize and create a real revolution against the government.
But Sheikh al-Yaqoubi, who has encouraged unity amongst Muslims in the past and has spoken out against violent jihad in the West, attended a conference in Istanbul last month of a variety of groups opposing the Assad regime. He says that he has consistently called for exclusively peaceful means to achieve regime change.
As religious leaders, to put you in the picture, Colm, just all the ulama, scholars, Muslim scholars, agreed no weapon should be carried during the peaceful demonstrations or no military resistance should take place against the regime. And we made it forbidden, religiously speaking, because we don't want a civil war. I ban all soldiers who defect from the army from carrying weapon to fight the Syrian army or the Syrian Secret Service, because we will end up half of the army fighting the other half, and the huge arsenal in the Syrian army, the country will be destroyed and people will be killed.
The momentum internationally now seems to be behind getting rid of Bashar al-Assad. Haitham al-Maleh, an 80-year-old former judge who has been jailed by the Assad regime and left the country in July, has just completed a busy itinerary in Europe, lobbying governments and human rights organisations to back his bid to have the Syrian leader prosecuted for crimes against his people. In a short mobile phone call to this programme, he said support is unanimous for his cause.
The response people who I met, all of them agree for this point.
Including foreign ministers, everybody.
Yes, they believe that Assad has no way to stay in Syria, so they have to leave.
Just what will provide the tipping point is hard to call, according to Petra Steenan, but the latest round of sanctions might make up the minds of one key group.
One grouping nobody really talks about is the business elite in Syria, and I think they could actually become a very strong force against the regime once there is sort of a tipping point in the streets. They're now sitting on the fence, but I know from my sources that some businessmen are really keen to join the demonstrators, and when that happens, the dynamics might change.
So what is the plan for life after Assad? A government in exile was ruled out at the recent conference in Istanbul. The plan so far, according to Sheikh al-Yaqoubi, is simply change.
We don't mind who comes to power. It's just a matter of oppression. We need justice in the country. And the Syrians are very aware of this. Syrians are united, Christians, Muslims, Shiites, Alawites, Druze and Sunnis, all they are rebelling against oppression and they just want a change of regime.
And that's Sheikh Muhammad al-Yaqoubi finishing that report.